Hey everyone, and welcome to this third tutorial. In this tutorial, we will be covering the natural devices. These devices will make sure that your terrain looks real life-ish. Of course, there are certain limitations to these devices, but I'm sure that within World Machine you will not very quickly approach these limitations. For this tutorial, we will be starting with this noise map. It's just an advanced Berlin with a displacement, and as a secondary input it's a bit like a noise map. This file, together with all the other TMDs during the tutorials, will be uploaded to my Patreon, so make sure to check that out. From this, I would like to apply some strata, some layering effect. Previously we have worked with the terrace device, and I've already mentioned that the strata device is really useful in such cases. So let's see what it does. If we now open the strata device, we are faced with a couple of options: strength, scale, smoothness, layers, tilt and heading. From the terrace device we can already recognize the layers. This essentially means that layers are created within the total amount of terraces. I have also previously said that clamping your terrain to a normalized value will help with the strata device. We can now see why. The strata device doesn't use amount of terraces like the terrace device, but it uses the strength and scale. The strength option essentially means how heavy do you want the terraces to appear. So if you put it at 0, nothing will happen. And if you put it at 3, the terraces will form with a very sharp edge, as we can see over here. I really like to put the strength at a maximum. This is because I'm going to apply a small trick afterwards that helps merge it a bit in. Putting the strength at a maximum value ensures that all the terraces that are possible will appear. For this tutorial, we're not going to change the scale quite a lot, but the scale in essence means how high or how tall do you want your terraces to be. So you can see in the top left that if I'm squeezing it a bit between 500 and a kilometer, you can see that the terraces are giants. However, they do not form uniformly. So at the bottom of the terrain here, there are no terraces, whereas on other areas there are. This is what I mean with the normalized value in tutorial 2 and in this tutorial. For this tutorial, we're going to put it a bit down, since we want to see the results of the strata and not just see 2 or 3 terraces. So I'm going to put it at 100. The smoothness together with the strength work hand in hand. If you put the smoothness all the way down at 0, you will see that we have an unusable terrain. This terrain is way too noisy for anything that we would like. So we're going to put the smoothness at a maximum. This ensures that the terrain will keep the terraces, but will also be a bit smoother, as we can see in the bottom left here. Furthermore, we're going to add some layers. Those work perfectly fine, same as the terrace device. And for the strata orientation, it speaks itself if you try around with it. So I'm quickly going to show it, but I motivate you to look into it yourself as well. The tilt just means how tilted it is. And a rule of thumb is how higher the tilt, how noisier the terrain gets. So if you would like a tilt, I would say put it around 20 or 30. The heading just means in which direction. So currently it's from the bottom right to the top left. However, if we change the heading a bit, now it's pointed directly towards us. Now it's in the opposite direction. And now it's back to normal. As mentioned, for this tutorial, I'm going to put the tilt at 0. Next up is the erosion device. You can find it in the nature section. Let's check the erosion device out. For the time being, let's focus on these parameters. The duration of the erosion device simply means for how long are you simulating the water effect. If we put it very low, you can see that terrain doesn't change a lot. However, if we put it at a maximum value, you can see that the terrain completely changes, and a lot of simulations have run over this project. I always like to keep it around 50. That's where you see the effects take place, but you don't waste a lot of computational time waiting on the erosion device. The rock hardness setting simply tells you how hard is the rock. It speaks a bit for itself, since a lower hardness rock will have more sediment and will flow easier. We can see this by lowering the rock hardness. You can see that the terrain gets way more eroded due to the softer rock. You can see this in real life with calcite and the dolomites, for instance. I always like to keep the shape of the terrain as I've inputted it. Otherwise there's no use of making a very cool terrain beforehand, putting an erosion on it, and the terrain completely changes. So I'm going to leave it quite high. Always make sure that it's not completely at 1, since then it doesn't affect. The sediment carry amount parameter shows how much sediment is being carried around. You can especially see this in the masks, but for us you can see it under the water. If I lower it, you can see that the sediment that has been transported from the mountains isn't being collected at the bottom. Whereas if I put it a bit higher, you can already see that there are channels being made to account for the sediment. I always like to put it quite high, since then the erosion really takes some shape. The erosion time intensifier almost works the same as the duration. If you put it at 0, the terrain gets rather unchanged, but if we put it at the maximum value, the terrain gets changed very severely. I always like to put it a bit in the middle, since that way you have best of both worlds. For now, that's all I wanted to say about the erosion device. Of course, you can look into the presets, and you can see in the top left that the terrain changes significantly depending on which details you choose. As previously mentioned in tutorial number 2, I never really liked the erosion device. So what I always do is I combine the flow mask and the previous terrain using a subtract at a very low value. This ensures that the flow lines are being in place, and you can see that there's quite a lot of them in this example. This is due to the amount of strata layers that we've used. Since every strata layer, if water is running down, you can very clearly see it over here. It creates a lot of channels, and in between there are also a lot of channels. As previously mentioned with the strata device, there are some certain tricks to help you with the high strength. One of them is an expander. So we're going to use an expander to expand the very steep ridges of the terrain. We do this by setting the filter type to linear slope and using the action just set on maximum. We now play around with it a bit. I always go between a value of 50 and 100. If we then look at it, we can see some certain changes at the very steep edges. So in this case, this edge was before 90 degrees and now it has been revamped a tiny bit to still a very high slope, but a bit more colorable slope. Now we can still see that the terrain is rather noisy. Again, as mentioned, this is due to the strata layers and the erosion working hand in hand, and one trick to solve this would be to use a snow device. So in this tutorial I'm not going to show the snow device fully, since it deserves its own tutorial on its own. But I'm going to show you a trick using the snow device, because as we can already see by just plugging it in, it creates this very nicely smoothed out sections with exposed rock. We're going to use this. For now we're going to put the snowfall at a low value and the stickiness to a very high value. What this does is that the snow is very sticky and will stick to the ground, so it will not run away a lot. As we can see, some noise has already been reduced. However, I would like to have a bit more noise reduced, so I'm going to put this at 50. Now we can see that the terrain is rather smooth with these nice exposed rocks. Lastly, we're going to use the thermal weathering and the beach device. So let's use the thermal weathering one. The thermal weathering device has a lot of interesting features, especially the older version of it. You can change the version by right clicking on the device and then setting choose device version to original. However, for this purpose I'm going to use the thermal weathering as it is. However, for this tutorial I'm going to use the thermal weathering device as it is with some mild changes. For now again, we're not going to look in the advanced settings, but just the talus production and the angle of repose. The talus production essentially means the same as the strength in the strata. If it's set to 0, no thermal weathering will appear, whereas if we put it at 1, thermal weathering will appear. Any values in between will be an average value between the two. For the angle of repose, we can see that by lowering the value, more talus is being formed since the rocks will fall down at a lower angle. However, if we put it higher, you can see that the taluses will disappear. I always like to have a bit of thermal weathering, so I usually put it around 25. Again, as previously mentioned in the previous tutorial, the thermal weathering device lowers the peaks, which I do not really like. So in order to combat it, we're going to use a combiner set at maximum. We're just going to combine the two, set them at maximum, and then amplifying it to the top. This has resulted in the following result. You can very clearly see the combined effect of the snow device and the thermal weathering, since the snow device has smoothed certain parts out, and now the thermal weathering device can nicely build on top of that, thus creating a nice smooth terrain. Lastly, we're going to use the coast erosion device. The coast erosion device makes a coast. Who would have thought? Usually it's important to set the water level to guide. You can do it manually, however you can also just press the button. I don't really like the coast erosion device and I don't use it anymore. A separate tutorial will be made on how to properly make coasts, since these coasts are completely flat and affect the terrain. So for this time being, we're just going to increase the beach size, as you can see in the top left. Nice beaches always gives a nice contrast to the world, and that is just beneficial. The inland height influence shows how much of the terrain inland gets changed. So if we put it at a large value, then the beach device will automatically average between the beach and the terrain. However, this is not really beneficial since we've liked our previous generations of terrain, so we would like to keep this at a minimum. I do advise to keep it a bit higher than 0, since then the beaches merge a tiny bit. Lastly, the parameter underwater smoothing smooths the underwater terrain. So if you put it at 6, the entirety of the ocean will be very smooth, and if we put it at 0, it won't. I always like to put it at 3 if I use the device, but you can of course put it at 0 if you have a custom ocean. For the time being, that was the tutorial. You might be wondering to yourself, hey, on the thumbnail this terrain was colorized. Yes, that's completely correct, and we will be covering that in the next tutorial using this terrain. I hope to see you there.